The lawyer's voice cracked through the phone like thunder. Miss Thompson, you have inherited $2.7 million from your estranged grandfather. I nearly dropped my coffee. My family had cut me off completely 3 years ago, calling me ungrateful and selfish when I refused to give my trust fund to my drug-addicted brother. They claimed I was destroying family unity. Now grandfather William, who supposedly hated me, had left me everything while leaving my golden child siblings absolutely nothing. Before we dive into this twisted family revenge story, I want to know where you are watching from. Drop your location in the comments below. Smash that like button if you are ready for some serious family karma. And do not forget to subscribe, because this inheritance revelation is just the beginning of the most shocking family betrayal you have ever heard. 3 years earlier, my world had imploded during what should have been a peaceful family dinner. My brother Marcus, the family favorite despite his cocaine addiction and gambling debts, had cornered me in the kitchen with tears streaming down his face. Rachel, I need the money from your trust fund. He had begged, his hands shaking from withdrawal. Just this once. I promise I will get clean. I had stared at him in disbelief. This was the 4th time in 2 years he had asked for money. The trust fund my grandfather had established for my college education had grown to nearly $100,000, and Marcus wanted me to cash it out to pay his dealers. Absolutely not, I had said firmly. That money is for my medical school tuition. You need rehab, not more enabling. The explosion that followed still haunted my dreams. Marcus had stormed into the dining room screaming that I was a selfish bitch who cared more about money than family. My parents, Robert and Linda Thompson, had immediately taken his side without even asking what happened. Rachel family comes first, my mother had said coldly, her perfectly manicured fingers drumming on the mahogany table. Your grandfather established that trust for family emergencies, and this qualifies. Medical school can wait, my father had added, adjusting his expensive watch. Your brother's life cannot. I had tried to explain that giving Marcus money would only fuel his addiction, but they refused to listen. My younger sister Emma, fresh out of her Ivy League college that my parents had fully funded, had joined the attack. You have always been selfish, Rachel, she had sneered. Ever since we were kids, everything had to revolve around your perfect grades and your perfect plans. For once, put someone else first. The irony was staggering. I had worked 3 jobs throughout high school while Emma got a brand new BMW for her 16th birthday. I had earned a full academic scholarship while Marcus had his college tuition paid despite barely graduating. I had been living in a studio apartment and eating ramen noodles while they lived in our family's mansion in the suburbs. When I refused to liquidate my trust fund, my father had stood up with a face like stone. Then you are no longer welcome in this house. We will not enable your selfishness any longer. Just like that, I was cut off completely. No phone calls, no birthday cards, no Christmas invitations. My mother blocked my number. Emma unfriended me on all social media. They even convinced my extended family that I had abandoned them in their time of need. The isolation had been devastating. I had spent countless nights crying in my tiny apartment, wondering if I had made the right choice. My grandfather, William, my father's father, had been particularly cold during our last interaction. When I had tried to explain my position, he had looked at me with disgust and said I was a disappointment to the family name. Your father raised an ungrateful child, he had said, his voice dripping with contempt. You clearly do not understand what family loyalty means. Those words had cut deeper than anything else. Grandfather William had been my hero growing up. He had built his construction company from nothing, working 18-hour days to provide for his family. I had always admired his work ethic and integrity. Hearing him call me ungrateful had shattered something inside me. Over the following 3 years, I threw myself into my studies and work. I graduated summa cum laude from nursing school and landed a position at the city's top hospital. I built a life for myself, made new friends, and tried to heal from the trauma of losing my entire family over money. I occasionally heard updates through mutual acquaintances. Marcus had been in and out of rehab 4 times, each stint costing my parents tens of thousands of dollars. Emma had married a wealthy investment banker and was living a life of luxury in Manhattan. My parents had sold some of their properties to cover Marcus's debts and treatment costs. Meanwhile, I had been completely erased from their lives. At family gatherings, they told people I was traveling or busy with work. They never mentioned that they had disowned me for refusing to enable my brother's addiction. The betrayal ran deeper than I had initially understood. Through a former family friend, I learned that my parents had actually been pressuring Grandfather William to change his will and remove me entirely. They had convinced him that I was selfish and money-obsessed, painting me as someone who cared more about material wealth than family bonds. What made it even more painful was discovering that my father had been systematically turning my grandfather against me for months before our final confrontation. He had been feeding him stories about my supposed greed and ingratitude, preparing the ground for my complete exclusion from the family. The financial manipulation went beyond just emotional abuse. My father, who managed my grandfather's business affairs as his power of attorney, had been positioning himself and my siblings as the sole beneficiaries of the family fortune. They had been planning to cut me out completely, while simultaneously demanding that I give up my own financial security for Marcus. The phone call from Harrison Blackwell and Associates changed everything. Attorney James Harrison's voice had been professional but tinged with confusion as he explained that my grandfather had updated his will just 2 weeks before his death. Miss Thompson, your grandfather specifically requested that you receive his entire estate, including his construction company, real estate holdings, and personal assets, Harrison had explained. He also left detailed instructions that you should be the sole executor of his will. I had been speechless. The grandfather who had called me ungrateful and money-obsessed had left me everything while completely excluding the family members who had supposedly won his favor. I do not understand, I had whispered. My family said he hated me. They told me he wanted nothing to do with me. On the contrary, Harrison had replied carefully. Your grandfather left a sealed letter for you, along with some additional documentation that I think you should see immediately. The drive to the law office felt surreal. My hands trembled as Harrison handed me the thick envelope marked "For Rachel Thompson," to be opened only in her presence. My grandfather's familiar handwriting covered multiple pages, and his words hit me like a physical blow. My dearest Rachel, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and the truth can finally be told. I need you to know that I never stopped believing in you or being proud of the woman you became. Your father has been lying to both of us for years. I discovered the truth about what really happened during that family dinner 3 years ago. Your father told me you had demanded money from Marcus and threatened to abandon the family if you did not get your way. He said you were greedy and manipulative, only caring about accumulating wealth. I was heartbroken and furious, which is why I was so cold to you during our last conversation. But 6 months ago, I overheard a conversation between your parents that changed everything. Your father was on the phone with someone bragging about how he had handled the Rachel problem by turning me against you. He laughed about how easy it was to manipulate an old man's emotions. Your mother added that cutting you off had been their plan all along because you were too independently minded and would not go along with their schemes. I then hired a private investigator to uncover the truth. What I found disgusted me beyond words. The letter went on to detail everything the private investigator had discovered. My father had been embezzling money from my grandfather's construction company for over 5 years, skimming profits and inflating expenses to cover his own extravagant lifestyle. The expensive cars, the luxury vacations, the private schools for Emma, everything had been funded through stolen money. More shocking was the revelation that my parents had been planning to have me declared mentally incompetent to access my trust fund. They had already consulted with lawyers about guardianship proceedings, intending to claim that my refusal to help Marcus proved I was not mentally stable. They wanted to gain control of my money to fund Marcus's continued addiction and their own lifestyle. My grandfather's investigation had uncovered financial records showing that my father had stolen over $400,000 from the company. The private investigator had also recorded conversations where my parents discussed their plans to manipulate legal proceedings to gain access to my inheritance after my grandfather's death. I changed my will to ensure that everything goes to you because you are the only one with integrity, my grandfather had written. You were right to refuse to enable Marcus's addiction. You were right to protect your future. I am ashamed that I fell for your father's lies and treated you so poorly during our last conversation. The company records and evidence of your father's embezzlement are in the safe deposit box. The key is with Attorney Harrison. I want you to decide whether to pursue criminal charges. You owe them nothing, Rachel. Build the life you deserve. The sealed envelope also contained copies of recorded phone conversations, financial documents showing the embezzlement, and a detailed timeline of my father's manipulation tactics. My grandfather had spent his final months gathering evidence of my family's betrayal and corruption. Attorney Harrison handed me another document, a formal letter my grandfather had written to my parents just days before his death, though he had never sent it. In it, he confronted them about their lies and informed them of his decision to leave everything to me. He had planned to expose their schemes publicly, but died before he could take action. Your grandfather also left instructions for me to contact the district attorney's office if you choose to pursue criminal charges against your father, Harrison explained. The evidence he gathered is quite comprehensive. As I sat in that law office, surrounded by evidence of my family's calculated betrayal, I felt a mixture of vindication and heartbreak. My grandfather had realized the truth, but it had taken him until his final weeks to uncover my father's years of deception. All those months of isolation and pain could have been avoided if he had simply asked for my side of the story. But more than that, I now understood the full scope of my family's manipulation. They had not just cut me off emotionally. They had actively worked to destroy my reputation, steal my inheritance, and control my financial future. The fight over Marcus's addiction had just been the excuse they needed to implement a plan they had been developing for years. The question now was, what to do with this information? I had the power to expose them publicly, pursue criminal charges, and ensure they faced consequences for their actions. But I also had the opportunity to simply walk away and build a new life with my inheritance, leaving them to face the natural consequences of their choices without my intervention. As I drove home that evening, my phone began ringing with calls from family members. Word had somehow leaked that grandfather's will had been read, and they were frantically trying to reach me. For 3 years, these same people had treated me like I was dead. Now they were desperate to reconnect. I let every call go to voicemail, but I listened to the messages. My mother's voice was panicked and pleading. My father sounded angry and demanding. Emma was crying and begging for forgiveness. Even Marcus, apparently sober enough to comprehend the situation, left a rambling message about family loyalty and second chances. But it was too late for apologies or explanations. They had made their choice 3 years ago, and now they would live with the consequences. The only question was how much justice I was willing to pursue. The next morning brought a parade of unexpected visitors to my apartment. I watched through my peephole as my father paced outside my door for 20 minutes, alternately knocking and shouting demands for me to open up. When that failed, he resorted to leaving increasingly threatening voicemails. "Rachel, this is ridiculous," his voice had snarled through my phone. "You cannot just steal our inheritance. That money belongs to the family, not just you." If you think you can cut us out after everything we have done for you, you are seriously mistaken. The irony was not lost on me. After 3 years of total silence, my father was suddenly concerned about family unity and shared resources. But his messages revealed something more sinister. He genuinely believed that my grandfather's money belonged to him by right, regardless of what the will actually said. By noon, my sister Emma appeared at my workplace, crying dramatically in the hospital lobby until security escorted her out. She had driven 6 hours from Manhattan, leaving her investment banker husband and their newborn baby, desperate to convince me to share the inheritance. "Please, Rachel, I know we made mistakes," she had sobbed as security guards flanked her. "But we are still family. Grandfather was obviously manipulated in his final days. You know he would have wanted us to share everything equally." Her performance was Oscar-worthy, but I recognized the manipulation tactics I had grown up with. Emma had always been skilled at weaponizing tears and emotional manipulation to get what she wanted. This was just a more desperate version of the same behavior. That evening, I called Attorney Harrison to discuss my options. His advice was practical and legally sound. "Miss Thompson, you should know that your family will likely contest the will," he had warned. "They have already contacted 3 different law firms trying to find someone willing to take their case. Most attorneys have declined because the evidence of your grandfather's mental competency is overwhelming, and the will was properly executed with multiple witnesses." "What about the embezzlement evidence?" I had asked. "That is where things get interesting," Harrison had replied. "I spoke with District Attorney Patricia Williams today. She is very interested in reviewing the financial documents your grandfather compiled. If you choose to pursue criminal charges, they are prepared to open a formal investigation immediately." The decision felt monumental. Pursuing criminal charges would not just expose my father's theft, it would destroy my family's reputation in our small community where grandfather's construction company was well known and respected. My father would likely face prison time, and the scandal would follow my mother and siblings for years. But as I considered my options, I realized I was not alone in this fight. My grandfather's private investigator, a former police detective named Patricia Rodriguez, contacted me directly. "Your grandfather hired me to find the truth, and I want to see this through," she had said during our coffee meeting. "I have been investigating financial crimes for 15 years, and what your father did goes beyond simple embezzlement. He was systematically defrauding an elderly man while manipulating family relationships to cover his tracks." Patricia had additional evidence that even my grandfather had not seen before his death. She had discovered that my father had been forging my grandfather's signature on loan documents, using the company as collateral for personal investments that had failed spectacularly. The total amount he had stolen was closer to $700,000 when all the fraudulent loans were calculated. "Your father is not just a thief," Patricia had explained. "He is a sophisticated white-collar criminal who has been running this scheme for years. The fact that he turned your family against you to protect his crimes makes it even worse." Through Patricia, I also connected with Margaret Foster, my grandfather's longtime accountant, who had been suspicious of the financial irregularities for months before his death. Margaret had tried to raise concerns with my grandfather, but my father had convinced him that she was getting old and making mistakes. "I knew something was wrong with the books," Margaret had told me during our meeting at her office. "But your father was very clever about hiding the theft. He would make legitimate payments to cover the stolen money just before audits, then steal it back afterward. It took months of detailed analysis to uncover the pattern." Margaret had also discovered that my father had been pressuring my grandfather to take out large loans against the company property, claiming they were necessary for business expansion. In reality, my father had been using these loans to cover his previous theft and fund his gambling addiction, a problem I had not even known existed. The picture that emerged was of systematic financial abuse spanning years. My father had not just stolen money, He had been psychologically manipulating my grandfather, while simultaneously destroying my relationship with him to prevent anyone from questioning his access to the company finances. As word spread through our community that grandfather's will had been read, other people began reaching out with their own stories about my father's behavior. Sarah Martinez, who had worked as my grandfather's secretary for 10 years, called to tell me about strange phone calls and document requests that had never made sense until now. Your father would call and ask me to send him copies of financial documents claiming your grandfather had requested them, Sarah had explained. When I tried to confirm with your grandfather directly, your father would get angry and say I was questioning his authority as power of attorney. Even more damaging was the testimony of David Kim, a former employee of my grandfather's construction company, who had been fired 2 years earlier. David had been terminated after raising questions about discrepancies in payroll and supply costs. My father had convinced my grandfather that David was trying to embezzle money himself, when in reality, David had been getting too close to discovering my father's scheme. I always wondered why your grandfather suddenly turned against me after 15 years of loyal service, David had said when he called me. Now it all makes sense. Your father needed me gone because I was asking too many questions about the missing money. As my network of allies grew, I began to understand the full scope of my father's manipulation. He had not just stolen money and turned my family against me. He had systematically destroyed relationships and reputations to protect his crimes. Multiple people had suffered because they had gotten too close to the truth. The most shocking revelation came from Dr. Elizabeth Warren, my grandfather's physician during his final months. When I met with her to understand his mental state, before changing the will, she revealed information that made my father's actions even more despicable. Your grandfather was sharp as a tack until the day he died, Dr. Warren had assured me. But he was deeply depressed about his relationship with you. He talked about you constantly wondering if he had made a mistake in believing your father's stories. The private investigation was actually part of his effort to understand what had really happened. Dr. Warren also revealed that my father had been pressuring her to document signs of dementia or mental decline that could be used to challenge any changes to the will. When she refused to falsify medical records, my father had tried to convince my grandfather to switch doctors. Your father wanted me to write that your grandfather was experiencing cognitive decline so he could contest any will changes, Dr. Warren had explained. When I told him your grandfather was completely mentally competent, he became very angry and accused me of not properly caring for my patient. With this alliance of allies and evidence, I felt ready to take the next step. But I also knew that my family would not go down without a fight. They had already proven they were willing to lie, manipulate, and destroy relationships to protect their interests. Escalating this battle would require careful planning and strategic thinking. The question was no longer whether to pursue justice, but how to ensure that my family faced appropriate consequences while protecting myself and my allies from their inevitable retaliation. My father had spent years perfecting his manipulation tactics, and he would not hesitate to use them against anyone who threatened his freedom. As I prepared for the next phase of this battle, I realized that this was about more than just money or inheritance. This was about holding people accountable for years of emotional abuse, financial theft, and systematic manipulation. My family had destroyed relationships and reputations to protect their crimes, and now it was time for them to face the consequences of their choices. The war was just beginning, and I intended to win. Just as I felt confident about moving forward with criminal charges, my carefully built alliance began to crumble in the most devastating way possible. The betrayal came from the person I had trusted most, Patricia Rodriguez, the private investigator, who had seemed so committed to justice. It started with a seemingly innocent phone call on a Tuesday morning. Patricia's voice sounded strained and apologetic as she delivered news that made my blood run cold. "Rachel, I need to tell you something that is going to be very difficult to hear," she had said, her usual confident tone replaced by obvious discomfort. "I have been contacted by your father's legal team, and they have made some serious allegations about the evidence we have been gathering." My heart sank as she continued. "They are claiming that your grandfather was not mentally competent when he changed his will, and they have medical records that supposedly support their position. They are also suggesting that the private investigation was conducted improperly, and that some of the financial evidence may have been obtained illegally." "What are you saying?" I had asked, though I already sensed where this conversation was heading. "I think we need to slow down and reconsider our approach," Patricia had replied. "Your father's attorneys are very sophisticated, and they have raised some valid concerns about the strength of our case. If we move forward with criminal charges and lose, you could face significant legal consequences for making false accusations." The shift in her tone was dramatic and suspicious. Just days earlier, Patricia had been passionate about pursuing justice and holding my father accountable. Now she was suddenly concerned about legal technicalities and potential risks that she had never mentioned before. Over the following week, Patricia became increasingly unavailable and evasive. When I finally cornered her at her office, the truth came out in the most painful way possible. "Your father offered me $50,000 to back away from this case," she had admitted, unable to meet my eyes. "But it is not just about the money, Rachel. He also showed me some things about your family situation that I had not considered before." I stared at her in disbelief. "What things?" "He explained how your refusal to help your brother with his addiction had torn the family apart," she had said, repeating the same lies my father had been telling for years. "He showed me text messages between you and your family that painted a very different picture of what happened 3 years ago." Those text messages were fake. I had protested, but I could see that Patricia had already made up her mind. "He also provided medical records showing that your grandfather had been experiencing memory issues and confusion in his final months," she had continued. "The doctor who signed off on his mental competency for the will change was apparently pressured by you to ignore signs of cognitive decline." Every word was a lie, but Patricia had chosen to believe my father's version of events over the evidence she had helped gather. The $50,000 bribe had obviously been the deciding factor, but she needed to justify her betrayal with a narrative that painted me as the villain. The impact of losing Patricia was devastating beyond just losing an investigator. She had been my primary connection to several other witnesses and evidence sources. When she withdrew her support, others began to question their involvement as well. Margaret Foster, the accountant, called me the next day with obvious nervousness in her voice. "Rachel, I have been thinking about this situation, and I am not sure I am comfortable testifying about financial irregularities," she had said. "These are serious accusations, and I do not want to get involved in a family dispute that might be based on misunderstandings." I could hear the coached language in her response. My father had clearly gotten to her as well, though probably through intimidation rather than bribery. Margaret had worked with local businesses for decades, and my father likely threatened to destroy her reputation in the community if she testified against him. Even more crushing was the call from David Kim, the former employee who had been fired for asking questions about missing money. "I am sorry, Rachel, but I cannot afford to get involved in this," he had said. "Your father's attorneys contacted my current employer and suggested that my claims about financial irregularities were actually attempts to cover up my own theft. I could lose my job if this continues." Within a week, my entire network of allies had either been bought off, intimidated, or convinced that supporting me was too risky. My father had proven that his manipulation skills extended far beyond just family relationships. He was capable of systematically destroying any opposition through a combination of bribery threats and character assassination. The legal implications were even worse than the personal betrayal. Without Patricia's investigation and the witness testimony, my case against my father became much weaker. Attorney Harrison warned me that proceeding with criminal charges would now be extremely risky. "Your father has managed to undermine most of our evidence," Harrison had explained during an emergency meeting. "Patricia's withdrawal is particularly damaging because she was our primary investigator, and her change of position will be used to suggest that the entire case was based on false information." "But the financial records still exist," I had protested. "The embezzlement happened regardless of what Patricia says now." "True, but proving it in court requires expert testimony and investigation that we no longer have," Harrison had replied. "Your father has been very strategic about neutralizing our ability to present a compelling case." The emotional toll was overwhelming. I had spent weeks building relationships and gathering evidence only to watch everything crumble because my father was willing to pay bribes and make threats that I could not or would not match. His years of experience in manipulation and corruption had given him tools that I simply did not possess. Even worse was the realization that my former allies were now potentially working against me. Patricia had access to all the evidence we had gathered, and she could easily share that information with my father's legal team to help them prepare counter-arguments. She knew our entire strategy and could anticipate every move we had planned to make. The betrayal also highlighted my fundamental disadvantage in this battle. My father had decades of experience in business dealings, legal maneuvering, and personal manipulation. He had financial resources that I could not match, and a willingness to use tactics that I found morally repugnant. Fighting him on his terms meant competing in an arena where he held every advantage. As I sat in my apartment that Friday evening, fielding calls from family members who had somehow learned about the investigation and were demanding explanations, I felt more isolated than ever. The brief period of hope and empowerment that had followed my grandfather's revelation was gone, replaced by the familiar feeling of being outnumbered and outmaneuvered by people who had no moral boundaries. My father had won this round decisively. He had neutralized my evidence, turned my allies against me, and positioned himself as the victim of false accusations. If I continued to pursue criminal charges, I would likely lose and face potential legal consequences for making unfounded claims against him. But as I replayed the events of the past week, I began to notice inconsistencies in my father's counterattack that suggested his victory might not be as complete as it appeared. His desperation to buy off and intimidate witnesses indicated that he was still vulnerable, and his willingness to pay Patricia $50,000 suggested that he was genuinely afraid of what we had uncovered. The question was whether I had the strength and resources to continue fighting after such a devastating setback, or whether this betrayal had effectively ended my chances of holding my family accountable for their years of abuse and manipulation. The breakthrough came from the most unexpected source: my grandfather's housekeeper, Maria Santos, whom I had never even considered contacting. She called me 3 days after Patricia's betrayal, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and determination. "Miss Rachel, I have been watching the news about your family's legal troubles," she had said in her soft accent. "I worked for your grandfather for 15 years, and I know things that nobody else knows. Things that prove your father is lying about everything." Maria had been essentially invisible to my family during all their visits and business meetings with my grandfather. As his live-in housekeeper, she had witnessed conversations and behaviors that no one realized she was observing. More importantly, she had been keeping detailed records of everything she saw because she loved my grandfather and was concerned about how my father was treating him. "Your grandfather was so sad about you," Maria had explained during our secret meeting at a diner across town. "He would sit in his study looking at pictures of you and crying. He kept asking me if I thought he had made the right decision about cutting you off. He never believed in his heart that you were really greedy or selfish. But Maria's most devastating revelation concerned the medical records that my father's legal team had used to suggest cognitive decline. Your father brought a fake doctor to the house 2 months before your grandfather died, she had revealed. This man pretended to be doing a routine checkup, but I heard him asking strange questions about memory and confusion that had nothing to do with your grandfather's actual health. Maria had recognized that something was wrong because she knew my grandfather's real doctor, Dr. Warren, very well. When a stranger showed up claiming to be conducting a medical evaluation, she had become suspicious and started paying closer attention to what was happening. I wrote down everything Maria had said, pulling out a small notebook filled with dates, times, and detailed observations. The fake doctor asked your grandfather questions designed to make him seem confused. When your grandfather answered clearly, the man would ask the same questions again, in different ways, trying to get contradictory responses. Even more damaging was Maria's account of my father's behavior during his final visits with my grandfather. Your father would shout at him and call him names when he thought nobody was listening, she had recounted. He told your grandfather that you had been spreading lies about the family and trying to turn everyone against each other. He said you were planning to have him declared incompetent so you could steal his money. These revelations provided crucial context for understanding my grandfather's emotional state during his final months. My father had not just been stealing money. He had been psychologically abusing an elderly man while simultaneously destroying his relationship with me through calculated lies and manipulation. Maria also had physical evidence that no one else possessed. Your grandfather gave me copies of important documents to keep safe, she had said, producing a manila envelope from her purse. He was worried that your father might destroy or change things after he died. He made me promise to give these to you if anything happened to him. The documents were explosive. They included original financial records that contradicted my father's claims about business expenses, handwritten notes from my grandfather, documenting his suspicions about missing money, and most importantly, a second letter addressed to me that provided even more details about his investigation. Rachel, if Maria is giving you this letter, then my first letter through Attorney Harrison has already exposed some of the truth, my grandfather had written. But there is more you need to know. I installed security cameras in my home office 6 months ago because I suspected someone was going through my personal papers when I was not home. The recordings are stored on a hidden device in my desk drawer. The combination is your birthday. The security footage was a game changer. Hours of recordings showed my father searching through my grandfather's desk, photographing financial documents, and even attempting to access his computer. The timestamps proved that these break-ins occurred when my father claimed to be handling legitimate business matters. Most damning was footage of my father's reaction when my grandfather confronted him about discrepancies in the company books. Instead of denial or explanation, the recording showed my father becoming verbally abusive and threatening, telling my grandfather that he would end up in a nursing home if he continued asking questions about the finances. "You ungrateful old man," my father could be heard saying on the recording. "After everything I have sacrificed for this family, you want to treat me like a criminal? Maybe it is time for you to step back and let people who actually understand business handle these decisions." The footage also captured my father's phone conversations, where he discussed his plans to have my grandfather declared incompetent and gain full control of his assets. In one particularly revealing call, he bragged about how easily he had handled the Rachel problem by turning the family against me. "The old man is starting to ask questions about the money," my father had said during a phone call that was clearly audible on the recording. "But I have got him so convinced that Rachel is the enemy that he will not listen to anything that might suggest I am involved. As long as everyone stays focused on her supposed greed, nobody will look too closely at where the money actually went." Armed with this new evidence, I contacted a different attorney, Sarah Mitchell, who specialized in elder abuse cases and had a reputation for taking on powerful defendants. Unlike Harrison, who was concerned about the complexities of family disputes, Sarah immediately recognized the criminal nature of my father's actions. "This is not just embezzlement," Sarah had said after reviewing Maria's evidence and the security footage. "This is elder abuse, psychological manipulation, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Your father has committed multiple felonies, and the evidence is overwhelming." Sarah also had connections that my previous legal team lacked. She worked regularly with Detective Michael Torres, who headed the district attorney's financial crimes unit, and had been looking for an opportunity to prosecute sophisticated white-collar criminals in our community. "We have been watching your father's business dealings for over a year," Detective Torres revealed during our meeting. "There have been complaints from other elderly clients about missing money and questionable transactions, but we never had enough evidence to build a case. Your grandfather's documentation and the security footage give us exactly what we need." The detective also revealed that Patricia Rodriguez was already under investigation for accepting bribes and interfering with criminal investigations. My father's $50,000 payment had been traced through financial records, and Patricia was facing potential criminal charges herself. "Your former investigator made a serious mistake when she accepted money to withdraw from this case," Detective Torres had explained. "That payment is documented and it proves obstruction of justice. She will likely be willing to cooperate with our investigation in exchange for reduced charges." Within days of connecting with this new team, the entire dynamic of the case had shifted. Instead of being the one making accusations that might not be believed, I was now working with law enforcement officials who had independent evidence of my father's criminal behavior. The psychological impact was tremendous. After feeling isolated and defeated by Patricia's betrayal, I suddenly had allies who possessed both the expertise and authority to hold my father accountable. More importantly, these allies were motivated by professional duty rather than personal relationships that could be manipulated or bought. Sarah Mitchell also helped me understand legal protections that I had not known existed. "Your father's attempts to intimidate witnesses and bribe investigators are separate crimes that carry serious penalties," she had explained. "Even if the original embezzlement charges were somehow dismissed, he has now committed additional felonies that are much easier to prove." As we prepared for the next phase of the legal battle, I realized that my father's apparent victory in neutralizing my original allies had actually been a strategic mistake. His willingness to pay bribes and make threats had created a paper trail that law enforcement could follow, and his desperation had led him to take risks that ultimately provided more evidence of his criminal behavior. The tide was turning, and this time I had allies who could not be bought, intimidated, or manipulated into abandoning the pursuit of justice. The final confrontation came sooner than anyone expected. Detective Torres and the district attorney's office moved swiftly once they had reviewed all the evidence. The arrest warrant was issued on a Thursday morning, and by noon, my father was in handcuffs being led out of his office in front of his business colleagues and clients. The charges were extensive: embezzlement, elder abuse, fraud, conspiracy, witness intimidation, and bribery. Each count carried significant prison time, and the evidence was so overwhelming that even my father's expensive legal team advised him to consider a plea bargain rather than risk a trial. The local news coverage was immediate and devastating to my family's reputation. "Prominent businessmen arrested for stealing from elderly father" was the headline that appeared across multiple media outlets. The story detailed not just the financial crimes, but also the psychological manipulation and family betrayal that had enabled years of abuse. My mother called me for the first time in 3 years, her voice hysterical with panic and rage. "How could you do this to your own family?" she had screamed through the phone. "Your father made mistakes, but destroying all of us is not the answer. You have ruined our lives over money that you did not even need." The conversation revealed how deeply she had bought into my father's lies and manipulation. Even faced with overwhelming evidence of his crimes, she was more angry at me for exposing the truth than at him for committing the acts that had torn our family apart. "I never wanted to destroy anyone," I had replied calmly. "I wanted accountability for years of abuse, theft, and manipulation." Dad chose to commit these crimes, and he chose to turn the family against me to cover them up. These are consequences of his actions, not mine. Emma's response was different, but equally telling. She arrived at my apartment unannounced, desperate, and pleading. Her previous arrogance replaced by obvious terror about her family's financial future. "Please, Rachel, you have to help us," she had begged, tears streaming down her face. "Mom and Dad are going to lose everything. The house, the cars, everything we grew up with. I have a baby to think about now. You have all this inheritance money. Surely you can help us figure something out." The audacity was breathtaking. After 3 years of treating me like I was dead, Emma wanted me to use my grandfather's money to save the family that had systematically abused both him and me. She seemed genuinely unable to understand why I might not be eager to rescue people who had shown me nothing but cruelty and manipulation. "Where was this concern for family when you cut me off for refusing to enable Marcus's drug addiction?" I had asked. "Where was this compassion when Mom and Dad were stealing from grandfather and turning him against me?" "You made your choices, Emma. Now you get to live with the consequences." Marcus's reaction was perhaps the most honest of all. When he called from his latest rehab facility, he was surprisingly clear-eyed about the situation. "I know I have no right to ask for anything," he had said. "My addiction hurt everyone, and I used it as an excuse to be selfish and manipulative. But I want you to know that I always knew Dad was lying about what happened that night. I just did not have the courage to speak up because I was desperate for money." His admission was both validating and heartbreaking. Even in the depths of his addiction, Marcus had understood that our parents were manipulating the family dynamic to serve their own interests. But his dependence on their financial support had prevented him from telling the truth that might have prevented years of pain and isolation. The legal proceedings moved quickly. Patricia Rodriguez, facing her own criminal charges, provided detailed testimony about my father's bribery attempt and his efforts to obstruct the investigation. Her cooperation, along with the overwhelming physical evidence, made conviction inevitable. My father ultimately accepted a plea bargain that included 7 years in prison, full restitution of stolen funds, and forfeiture of assets to cover damages. The construction company that my grandfather had built from nothing was liquidated to pay for legal fees and victim compensation. My parents lost their house, their cars, and their social standing in the community. But the most satisfying outcome was not the criminal conviction or financial penalties. It was the public vindication of my grandfather's faith in me and the restoration of relationships that my father's manipulation had destroyed. Dr. Warren reached out to apologize for not speaking up sooner about my father's attempts to pressure her into falsifying medical records. Margaret Foster contacted me to explain how she had been intimidated into withdrawing her support and to offer her assistance with managing my grandfather's business assets. Even more meaningful were the connections I made with people who had also been hurt by my father's manipulations. David Kim, the former employee who had been fired for asking inconvenient questions, became a close friend and business advisor. Maria Santos, whose courage and loyalty had been crucial to exposing the truth, became like a grandmother to me. Sarah Mitchell, the attorney who had believed in the case when others wavered, became both a professional colleague and personal friend. Through her, I met other survivors of financial abuse and family manipulation, creating a network of people who understood the complex trauma of being betrayed by those who were supposed to protect you. As I rebuilt my life with my inheritance and newfound freedom, I realized that my biological family's rejection had actually been a gift. It had forced me to develop independence, resilience, and the ability to recognize genuine relationships versus manipulative ones. The people who chose to support me were far more valuable than those who shared my DNA, but had never truly cared about my well-being. I used part of my grandfather's inheritance to establish a foundation that provided legal assistance to elderly people experiencing financial abuse by family members. The William Thompson Foundation became a lasting tribute to my grandfather's memory and ensured that other families might be spared the years of manipulation and betrayal that had nearly destroyed our relationships. Looking back on this journey 3 years later, I understand that justice is not just about criminal convictions or financial compensation. It is about breaking cycles of abuse, holding people accountable for their choices, and creating space for authentic relationships to flourish. My biological family chose manipulation and greed over love and honesty, and they are now living with the natural consequences of those choices. I did not destroy my family. They destroyed themselves through their own actions and decisions. I simply refused to enable their dysfunction any longer and chose to pursue truth over comfortable lies. That choice led to pain and isolation in the short term, but ultimately resulted in freedom, justice, and the opportunity to build genuine relationships based on mutual respect and honesty. My grandfather's final gift was not just money or property. It was the truth that set me free from years of gaslighting and manipulation. He gave me the evidence I needed to prove my own worth and the resources to build a life surrounded by people who truly care about my well-being rather than what they can take from me. Sometimes the family you choose is more valuable than the family you are born into. Sometimes walking away from toxic relationships is the only path to genuine happiness and peace. And sometimes justice delayed is still justice served, especially when it comes with the truth that validates everything you knew in your heart but were told was wrong. Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and your own integrity? When toxic family members demand you sacrifice your well-being for their benefit, how do you find the strength to say no? If this story resonated with your own experiences of family betrayal or financial manipulation, please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your stories matter, and they help others feel less alone in their struggles. If you enjoyed hearing about how karma eventually caught up with my manipulative family, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe for more true stories about justice, family drama, and choosing yourself over toxic relationships. Share this video with anyone who needs to hear that they are not crazy for setting boundaries with family members who do not respect them. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone else's destructive behavior, even when that someone is family.